Okay. So welcome everyone. I'm going to get my slideshow going and then we will get going. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about human subjects research as it is related to undergraduates, so all of you. And I think that the more appropriate name for this training might be how to impress your professor by knowing important things about human subjects research, because that's probably why a lot of you are here. And so we're going to kind of give you a brief introduction to help you get started and really start with a leg up. So our agenda for today, we're going to introduce you to something called the IRB. If you don't know what that stands for now, you will by the end of the class. Then we'll talk about how you will determine if something is actually human subjects research. So in this field, it's really common. People who are participating in research are called subjects or participants. These terms are interchangeable, and some people just prefer one or the other. It's really a lot more common in clinical research to use the term subject because that's what's in the regulations, but then in other types of research, people oftentimes prefer the term participants. So no real distinction there. The third thing we're going to talk about is submitting a new project to the IRB. And then lastly, what you can do to get a leg up now, literally today. So without further ado, let's start talking about the IRB. So we're going to start this part of the training by talking about an experiment that was conducted from 1932 to 1972. That's not a typo. It was over 40 years, and it was called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So in this experiment, it was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service in Macon County, Alabama. It was designed to study the progression of untreated syphilis. So if you're not familiar, syphilis is widely considered a sexually transmitted infection. But I always like to mention that around 60% of those with syphilis in Macon County had contracted it from their mothers during childbirth, so not from sexual contact. All research participants were Black men, 600 in total, and 399 of whom had syphilis and 201 who did not. These men were told that they were being treated for bad blood, which referred to many ailments at the time, including anemia, fatigue, muscle aches, and syphilis. So it was actually kind of a broad classification. And they were not actually told that they were being enrolled in a study. They were just told that they were being treated for bad blood. So they were not actually ever told that they were being studied for untreated syphilis. By 1943, penicillin became a common treatment for syphilis, but these men were actually prevented by the study doctors from getting treatment. And this wasn't like a benign thing. The study doctors actually went out into the community and gave the doctors in the community a list of the people who were in the Tuskegee syphilis study and wouldn't let those doctors treat those patients. Additionally, these men this study happened around the time that World War II happened, and these men were prevented from being drafted into the war because the study doctors knew that if they went through the medical clearance process for being in the military, that they would get treated for their syphilis. So this wasn't some benign, oh, they just weren't treated because penicillin wasn't around. They were actively prevented from seeking treatment from penicillin for over 20 years since it became available in 1943. So, as you might expect, this sparked outrage. So after bringing up his concerns for 7 years, there was a doctor who was affiliated with the PHS who leaked the story to one of his journalist friends at the Associated Press. And this is what really sparked the outrage across the United States. So I don't want to give the impression that there was no opposition to this experiment at all, because there were, for example, in 1965, radical leftist groups that held rallies to end the study. There was definitely discontent within the Public Health Service about this study, but it still went on for 40 years. When this story broke, the government said they would conduct an internal review, but it became really apparent that this wasn't going to be enough. So the federal government decided to actually act. So 2 years after the story broke about Tuskegee, the National Research Act was passed. So that's 1974. The National Research Act of 1974 established institutional review boards, or IRBs. So the IRB is a committee that applies research ethics by reviewing the methods proposed in research to ensure that they follow very common ethical principles. And so that is who I work for, and who I do all this training on behalf of is the Institutional Review Board at UC Davis. So the National Research Act also mandated that IRB approval is required for human subjects research studies, so any studies that involve humans. And the UC Davis IRB reviews human subjects research conducted by UC Davis researchers. So pretty much every large research institution has their own IRB. So what is the purpose of the actual IRB review? Like what are these sort of like ethical things that we're thinking about? So our first concern is to make sure that we protect the rights and welfare of research participants. And the second is that we ensure that research activities are compliant with the federal regulations, state policies, and other policies, such as like UC-wide policies, but also UC Davis specific policies. So it's important to keep in mind that these policies and laws and regulations and things like that, and just are the ethical principles we follow in general, are designed to protect individuals, and that includes individuals' private data. So that is the whole purpose of IRB review. So when we talk about the IRB or the Institutional Review Board, here at UC Davis, it looks like this. We have administration, which is what I'm part of, and that is actually where the bulk of submissions to the IRB are reviewed. And so we are UC Davis staff with expertise in those federal regulations, state laws, and policies that I had discussed before. And so we actually review the bulk of research that is submitted here. However, we also have our 3 committees, which are composed of faculty, staff, and community members. These include physicians, main campus faculty, pharmacists, nurses, clinical research professionals, and any sort of community member that would have kind of any sort of buy-in or tied to the community. So we have a community member right now, for example, who's a judge, and we have another one who actually is a firefighter. They just are not affiliated with UC Davis. So IRBs are required to have one member who's a non-scientist and then one of those community members. So with the assistance of IRB administration, these committee members complete IRB review of submissions. So I was just talking about human subjects research, but we actually have a very specific definition of human subjects research that is in the federal regulations. So I'm going to explain those to you now, because by knowing and understanding what human subjects research is, you'll be able to know and understand if you need to submit to the UC Davis IRB when you're conducting research. So like I said, the IRB reviews human subjects research. That is what is under our purview. So there's kind of 2 questions that you have to ask yourself when you are trying to decide if the research that you're doing is human subjects research. And that first question is the project research at all? If the answer to that is no, I'm not conducting research, then it does not fall under the purview of the IRB and you're not expected to submit to us. The second question you have to ask yourself is, does the project involve human subjects? If your project does not involve human subjects, it also does not fall under the purview of the IRB. So if your study involves, for example, non-human animals, then it would not be subject to the IRB. So that is something that's good to know. And then only if you answer yes to these 2 questions about is your project research and does it involve human subjects, do you submit to us? And now we're going to go into like the very specific definitions that I was talking about before. So what is research? Research is defined by the federal regulations as a systematic investigation, including development, testing, evaluation, designed to develop and contribute to generalizable knowledge. So a systematic investigation is any activity that involves a prospective, so you plan ahead of time, plan to obtain data and conduct an analysis to answer a question. And knowledge is generalizable when the conclusions drawn from the data analysis will be applied to populations outside of that specific study population. So in other words, if the results will be of the systematic investigation are expected to be generalized to a larger population beyond the site of data collection, then the knowledge is considered generalizable. So that probably sounds like a lot of words and you're like, I do not know what you're talking about. I need some examples. We're going to go there now. So I actually think it's really easy when you're trying to understand these definitions to think about what is not research. So for example, in this column, we have IRB review not being required for things like journalistic activities. So if you were a journalist for the school newspaper and you're conducting interviews for a story that you're writing, and then you write up that story, that's not going to be considered human subjects research because you had no prospective plan. So like plan ahead of time to ask, I'm going to ask X number of people these questions, then I'm going to do this data analysis, and then I'm going to publish it in this school paper. You're going to ask probably a couple leads, their opinions on something, and go from there. So it's not systematic in any way, and it's not really generalizable. So that's why journalistic activities are not considered human subjects research. We also have oral history projects. Same thing here. You're not actually making any sort of general or contributing to generalizable knowledge because you're just asking people about their own experiences in a very specific context. We have something called case reports and case series. This is much more common in medicine. And so this is when you say, oh, this patient had a very rare disease and it presented in a very rare way, and I want to write information about it and then publish it. This isn't considered human subjects research because if you only have one or a small handful of people, then that is not considered generalizable. We also have quality improvement and quality assurance programs. Once again, this is pretty common in the medical field. And so say you're working with a doctor and he wants to make sure that his patients come back to their follow-up visits more frequently. So he starts implementing text reminders. If he's going to analyze to see if that program worked, that would be called like a quality improvement project. And so because it's not generalizable outside of his clinic, then that would not be considered human subjects research. And then for program evaluation, we see this really commonly with sort of programs where like programs that are done throughout the state of California. So maybe a program looking at food stamps or CalFresh and how certain advertisement materials are effective or not effective. That's considered program evaluation. It's not generalizable, so it's not going to be human subjects research. This like bottom quadrant is pretty much like everything else you would encounter in life. It's not really worth talking about. That's not usually where the confusion here comes from. So I'm going to talk about what exactly are human subjects. This is a very kind of odd definition, so it's not as intuitive as you would think. I was interviewing someone for a job recently, and we asked them what a human subject was, and they said, well, you know what a human is, but that is not what the federal regulations use as a definition of a human subject. So without further ado, human subjects are any living individual about whom an investigator conducting research does any of the following. So number one is if the investigator obtains information or biospecimens through some sort of intervention with that individual and then analyzes it. So an intervention is any physical procedure, and that can include things like blood draws, but also manipulations of the subject or that subject's environment. So if you gave a subject some sort of medication for research purposes, that would also be considered an intervention. Next, we have interactions. So if the investigator obtains information through an interaction and then analyzes it, then that's also considered human subjects research. So an interaction is just any communication or interpersonal contact between the investigator and a subject. So for example, an interview or a survey, or some sort of focus group. It is important to know for interactions that you don't actually have to be in person for that to count as an interaction. You can publish a survey online and have someone complete it, and that's still considered an interaction, even though you're not in the room together. And then lastly, the one that really confuses people tends to be if an investigator uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens as part of the research. So identifiable private information is information where you can tell who the person that who the data belongs to or who the biospecimen belongs to in any way. So for example, if you were collecting samples as part of some research that you were doing with the medical campus, and you were writing the patient's information on the tube that was later going to be analyzed, that would be considered creation of private identifiable information. Or if you were using remnant samples, so leftover samples from the clinical lab, and you could tell who those samples came from, that would also be considered a privately identifiable biospecimen. So that one kind of is the one that trips people up. So it's important to understand the distinction. But like I said, it's a lot easier if you go through some examples. So things that we would need to submit to the IRB, because they're both research and they include human subjects, are things like clinical trials. I hope that's pretty intuitive. You have some sort of intervention, you're giving some sort of medical device or medical drug to someone and researching it. That is definitely human subjects research. If you are conducting any sort of survey to develop generalizable knowledge, so we all fill out surveys for companies and things like that, you know, how was your service, things like that. Those aren't considered human subjects research because they're not trying to create generalizable knowledge. They're just trying to improve their product. But if you are conducting a survey that you're going to then like analyze the data from and then like publish or present somewhere, then that's going to oftentimes be considered generalizable. And then also retrospective, meaning a study where you looked at data that had already been, or data or information that had already been collected using data from patient medical records, because you are looking at private identifiable information. That's also considered human subjects research because you are doing a study looking at all these patients to create generalizable knowledge, and then you're also looking at private identifiable information. So things that are research but do not involve human subjects are things like analysis of publicly available anonymous or de-identified data or biospecimens. So if you don't know where the data or the biospecimens are coming from, then that's not going to be considered human subjects research. And so a really good example of that is we get a lot of studies where people do analysis of different social media posts. So Twitter's the most common one. And so people do analysis of people's Twitter feeds, but since Twitter tweets are publicly available, that's not considered private information. And so you actually don't need IRB review in order to look at that. And then for another example is like what I'd given before, which is non-human animal research. So hopefully you understand the difference between non-human animals and humans. And so if you're doing that type of research, then you don't have to worry about submitting to the IRB, but there is another committee that's kind of our sister committee called IACUC, which you would submit to when you're having studies involving vertebrate animals. So just something to be aware of. And I'm going to stop here if anyone has any questions, because we're going to go into some kind of quiz examples. Does anyone have any questions or anything? You can put them in the chat too. I don't see anything though, so I'm going to keep going, okay? I want you to kind of like test your knowledge, and I'm not going to ask you to reply in the chat or anything like that, because I know like some of you might be on your phones and it's not always super easy to respond, but try to kind of follow the logic through the next few examples. So a researcher is using a rat model to test if a potential drug for the treatment of epilepsy can bind to its therapeutic target. Would this be considered human subjects research? Hopefully, since we just talked about that, it's a little bit easy. So take a couple seconds to guess. Like, is it human subjects research or not? And then I'll tell you the answer. Okay. So this is not considered human subjects research because we're in this bottom left quadrant. Remember, the answer has to be yes to both questions. So this is not considered human subjects research because no interaction or intervention with humans is being conducted, and there's no use of private identifiable information. And so this is definitely not going to be considered human subjects research, although it is research. So you do not have to submit to the IRB. The next example, so you're in a political science class and you're learning about how surveys of potential voters are conducted. One of the assignments includes developing a survey in a group ahead of this as a group project ahead of this year's election, which, reminder, November 8th is election day. The last day to register is October 24th. So register to vote, everyone. And this survey will be distributed online. So do we think, or then lastly, sorry, results will be presented in class. So just to the class, and it's just for a classroom project. So do you think this is human subjects research? Yes or no? I'll give everyone a couple seconds. I see someone chatted something. No. Yes. Oh, we have like some discontent. Okay, so for this one, it's not considered human subjects research because the intent of the project is to learn how to develop surveys, not to develop generalizable knowledge. So remember, the results were just being spread or disseminated in your class. And so it's not really, you're not trying to contribute to generalizable knowledge. You're just trying to learn as part of this project how to conduct human subjects research, or not, sorry, how to conduct a survey. I use that phrase a lot. So yeah, this one would not be considered human subjects research, but similar example, you are working with your political science professor to develop a survey ahead of this year's election. The survey will be distributed online, and there's an intent to contribute to the field of research around using social media for political surveys. So this isn't a class project anymore. This is something that's being done in conjunction with your professor, who then is looking to contribute to the field. So do we think this is human subjects research? Yes or no? Cool. I have a couple people responding in the chat. I definitely appreciate that. So yes, this is considered human subjects research because it's a systematic investigation, right? Their professor's like, we're going to put together the survey and we're going to distribute it to people. There's an intent to contribute to generalizable knowledge, meaning that they wanted to contribute some information about social media surveys. And then lastly, there's an interaction with those subjects via survey. Even though it's an online survey, that still counts. So really, the clincher between those last two examples was the purpose, like the intent of doing that survey. So in that example where it was a class project, the intent was to learn how to conduct surveys and how to create collection tools and things like that. Whereas the intent for this project was to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And so it was human subjects research. So I always like that example. I think it hopefully clarifies things. And then my last example question. So you're a principal investigator or PI. I would get familiar with this term because you're going to hear it a lot. It's used in both STEM and then non-STEM research. Although my former neighbor who was in the department, the German department, said that they use a term in German for it that essentially means your science dad. Kind of interesting. Anyway, so your PI has purchased anonymous blood samples for a biobank to determine the effect long-term storage has on the integrity of a specific protein. Do we think this is human subjects research, yes or no? And I'll like highlight kind of some of the important information, which is anonymous. Cool. More responses and you're getting more confident. So IRB's review is not required because no interaction or intervention with humans is occurring, and there's no use of private identifiable information. Those are anonymous samples. So that's definitely important to know about. There is a caveat there for FDA regulated research, but if you're doing FDA regulated research, your PI will make sure that you get the appropriate approvals and things like that. So what if you're not sure you need to submit to the IRB? You have the following options, because we don't expect you all to be experts and we are definitely here to help. So you can check out our IRB website. We have this page that's called, Does My Project Need Review by the IRB? And on it, there's an interactive determination questionnaire where you can actually go through different questions to help you determine if your project is human subjects research and needs to be submitted. You can also contact us. So here's our email. This is all over this presentation, but it's hs-irbeducation@ucdavis.edu, and you'll be able to talk to one of our IRB administrators and get your questions answered about if you need to submit or not. And then lastly, you can submit what's called the HRP 210 request for determination. This is a request for a not human subjects research determination, and no other documents need to be submitted if you submit this on IRBnet. Which is the portal that we use to talk to researchers. So you have three options here. No option is better than the others. I would just encourage you to look at the website and then contact us or submit on IRBnet. So when we're talking about where to submit on IRBNet, you're going to submit on irbnet.org. It drives me crazy because people go, I went to irb.net and I didn't see where to submit to the IRB. It's because it's irbnet.org. They should rename their company. It looks like this. So they haven't changed their home screen in 7 years, at least since I've been doing research. And so if you're out on this website, you're in the right place. And I can say that pretty confidently. Okay. Now we're going to go into what you do if your project is human subjects research and you have to submit to the IRB. Does anyone have any questions at this point? And we'll have time for questions at the end too, so no worries. And you can unmute yourself if you don't want to type in the chat. All right. And you can also private message me in the chat too, because I can see all that. So now we're going to talk about when you do need to submit, because you're like, I'm definitely doing human subjects research. What should you do? We have a website. I used to kind of walk people through the different steps on how to submit, but I actually don't think it's very useful because you're not going to remember between now and in a few months, or maybe even a couple years when you become like a junior specialist, or you're starting to work on your senior thesis, things like that. It might be a long time until you actually have to submit to us. So I would just encourage you to keep in mind that we have this new projects webpage. There's a link to it at the very end of this presentation. It has step-by-step directions for submitting to the IRB, including information about how to set up that irbnet.org account and complete any required training. So definitely check that out. And like I said, there's a link to this page at the end of this training where I put all of our helpful resources, okay? Also on this page, something I think is particularly helpful if you're doing non-STEM research is these example submissions. We call them cheat sheets. They are something that we worked really hard on actually to serve as example submissions. And so this is what an approvable study would look like. So like for this example, this is for a chart review study where you would be looking at someone's medical records. It would tell you, kind of common mistakes that people make and how to make sure that all the different documents you would have to submit are consistent. So definitely use those. And then this might seem weird, but feel free to borrow the language from these cheat sheets. It's not considered plagiarism to reuse information when you're submitting to the IRB. So definitely don't reinvent the wheel. It's okay. You don't have to find like a slightly different way to explain your research if you're doing things similarly to how we explain them in the cheat sheets. So definitely we just are concerned with making sure that you give us the information of what you're actually doing as part of your project, okay? So definitely feel free to borrow language. All of the researchers do it. They reuse things all the time. So feel free to do that. So what happens when you actually submit? So you've submitted your new project to the IRB. What actually happens at that point? So once you submit your project, an intake analyst is going to check for the basic requirement and then route your project for review. During that time, there's going to be some back and forth possibly on irbnet.org. So there's this thing called project mail, and that is the communication system that you'll use to talk to the intake analyst. Once it's routed, it's going to be reviewed by IRB administration or one of those convened committees that I had talked about. And the way that we decide this is based off of like the risk level of the study and then also certain regulatory categories that things can fall in or not fall in. Once again, there's gonna be a lot of back and forth on IRBnet. So just make sure that you're responding because we can't approve your study if you're not telling us the information that we need to approve it. And then just as a reminder that we do have the administration and then the different committees. And then lastly, we'll issue a determination. And then once we issue a determination, that means that you are either good to go and start, or that we actually need a little bit more information, but we'll go into that distinction. So what are the determinations you can get for a new project? So as I just discussed before, you can get a not research determination. We might tell you that something's not human subjects research. And then you can also get a not engaged determination. So that means that human subjects research is going on in other places, but UC Davis specifically is not engaged. So this can happen, say, I think for students, the most common example I've seen is someone had transcribed their interviews that they had done in a different language, and they needed them to be translated into English. And the student who was doing the translation didn't have access to any identifiers as part of the transcription, like there was no birth dates or anything like that. So it was essentially anonymous data that they were transcribing. And so we issued a human subjects research, but not engaged, because no one at UC Davis is actually engaged in the research, since those surveys or interviews rather were done elsewhere. So you don't have to worry about that too much. It doesn't come up a lot, but it is good to know about. If your study goes to one of those committees that I had discussed before, then sometimes they can it's not really that they deny the study, but they just say that they're going to have another meeting in order to approve it. So you can get a determination from the committee, such as modifications required, which means that, hey, can you make these couple of tweaks, and then we'll be able to approve the study. Deferred, which means that we have a lot more questions, we're going to have to talk about it at the next committee meeting. Or not approved. So these ones specifically, these three you're only going to get these from if your study goes to committee, which a lot of the research that you all are doing won't actually go to committee. We also have our, green means good. So the two determinations that help you decide, or that will show that you're ready to start the research, are exempt or approved. So exempt is for a particular type of research, which we'll talk about, and then approved is for all other types of research. Okay. So this comes up a lot. A lot of people don't, including sometimes the professors that you work with, will not know the difference between not research, not human subjects research, not engaged, and exempt. So as a reminder, if something is not human subjects research, it's not under the IRB's purview, and IRB review is not required. So all three of these, IRB review is not required. But then IRB review is required for exempt research. And this really throws people off, because exempt usually means that something doesn't apply. And so people say, oh, my study is exempt, so it doesn't have to be reviewed by the IRB. That's not actually what that means. IRB is still required for exempt studies. So just briefly, what is exempt research? These are specific categories of social, behavioral, and educational research that are exempt from the federal regulations. So these include things like surveys, interviews, focus groups, and some benign behavioral interventions. The thing that you should remember is that the IRB has to be the one to tell you that your study is exempt. It's not a determination that you make on your own. It's something that we have to make, which is why we ask for it to be submitted to us. Okay. So what happens after approval? If you make any changes to your study, we'll ask you to submit modifications. Sometimes if something goes awry, there's new risk information, especially like in clinical trials, less relevant to non-STEM research, there's reportable new information. Continuing review for specifically FDA regulated research. And then closures, because you can't, have a study be open forever. You actually close out the study at the end. So we're not going to go into these they're called post-approval submissions, but it is important that you know that they exist. And then before I wrap up, are there any questions before we talk about what you can do to get a leg up today? All right. So what can you do to get a leg up now? The biggest thing that you can do for yourself is complete city training. So this is required ethics training for anyone engaged in human research at UC Davis. So if you are engaged in biomedical research, you're going to complete the city basic course for biomedical researchers and staff. If you are engaged in social or behavioral research, you're going to complete the city basic course for social behavior and behavioral researchers and staff. There's a very similar training on the website that's called the RCR training. Do not take the RCR versions of this course, because those are not versions that we accept. Okay, so just that's a very, very common mistake. And you don't want to waste your time taking these RCR courses. So just make sure that you're taking the city basic course for biomedical researchers and staff, and city basic course for social and behavioral researchers and staff. I put the exact words that you are supposed to use. So definitely make sure you're careful about that. And then if you're engaged in an FDA regulated clinical investigation or an NIH clinical trial, so these actually link to to the definitions of those things so that you can determine that. You're going to complete that city basic course for biomedical researchers and staff, and either the GCP for clinical trials with investigational medical devices or GCP for clinical trials with investigational drugs and biologics. So the way that you can determine which one you're going to do is if you're mostly doing device studies, then you're going to complete that one. If you're mostly doing studies on investigational drugs, then you'll complete that one. You can complete both if you want. I've done both because I used to do a lot of research with both devices and drugs. And so you can if you want. You don't get like any bonus points or anything. You'll just know more things. So that is like city training is something that you could literally get done today. And then if you go to apply to work in a lab or be a junior specialist, or if you're trying to work with a professor on a particular project and you know that they do human subjects research, you can say like, yeah, I've already done my city training. And they'll be like, oh, that's really like cool that you knew about that. That's impressive. It shows that you were a go-getter. Great question. So city and GCP training is valid for 3 years. I have to think about that. It's been a while. Yeah, for 3 years. So they're valid for a really long time. So I would take it. It's not something you have to renew every year or anything like that. And if you do have to renew it, it's the shorter version of it. It's like a refresher class. So not too bad. That's a great question though. Thank you, Fahim. So some helpful resources for new submitters. I would join our listserv. We do a monthly newsletter, and so you'll get some more information from there. We talk about websites, web pages that we've updated, upcoming trainings like this one, and also just sort of resources, things like that. Our required education page that has all that information about city that I just talked about. So the actual city page is cityprogram.org. The IRB Net webpage, this is also one of the web pages on our website, the IRB website, that has information about how to do different things in IRB Net, whether it's signing things on IRB Net or submitting documents. And then the actual IRB Net website is irbnet.org. We have our IRB Forms webpage. We have all these templates and forms that you can use, so you don't have to start from scratch. And so that webpage has all of those forms that we use. We have our new projects webpage, which was that one I had talked about before, that has all the different steps for how to actually submit to us. And then we have something called the UC Davis Investigator Manual. And so technically your principal investigator or PI is supposed to sign off on this and or sign that they confirm that they've already read this manual, but it's actually helpful for all researchers to read. It has all the different IRB requirements and some pretty good information. It's all of our policies and things like that too. And then lastly, we have office hours every Friday. So actually, right after this, I have office hours combined with the CTO's, the clinical trials office. We help people out with like regulatory and IRB questions. And then all of the other weeks, it's just IRB. So if you have any IRB related questions, you can always ask us every Friday from noon to 1. These are via Zoom. And so you'll be able to kind of like just log on and ask your question, and we'll be able to help you out. So I don't actually have anything after this. So if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. Thanks, everyone. Oh, I said I was going to stop recording when 1 second, everyone.